I gotta say, this Sega Saturn intro does look pretty cool, especially it's almost like very revolutionary at the time, especially back in 1994 or 1995 from everywhere else. So, greetings ladies and gentlemen, it is I am the one and only Pac-Man here, and I am from the likes of the Mexi Toys videos. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our new Let's Play on a game that is released on the Sega Saturn. So I know you guys are probably thinking, hey Pac-Man, have you already done Sonic 3D Flickies Island or Sonic 3D Blast before? Well, here's the thing though, it was thanks to Tiana did already tackle through this game, but on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis. So as you can see, we are experiencing Sonic 3D Blast or Sonic 3D Flickies Island, not only in European versions, but as well as Japanese version as well, but this time as you can see, this is the Sega Saturn version of the game. So basically it's almost like a, some sort of like a 32-bit version of the forms of Sonic 3D Blast or anything else like that. Although this particular version of the game did came out exactly the same year as in the Sega Genesis / Sega Mega Drive version, but there are some slight differences you might realize, is that first of all, we now actually have a background music on the title screen, which does sound pretty, familiar if you ever played Sonic Generations before in one of those missions, as far as this is worth considering about. And on top of that, the menu selection, as you can tell, also looks a bit different too. That, as you can tell, rather than just having ourselves the control set up, or you're still able to actually have the sound test option. So as a result though, instead, rather than just having controls as the option, so instead it actually tells you help of how the actual items plays out to be. So with that being said though, let's get to it with Sonic 3D Flickies Island for specifically the Sega Saturn. And as well as that, I also want to point things out, I don't think it's possible we can able to tackle for the PC version just because of, you know, limitations as far as the forms of moving on to the next generation when it comes to PC and stuff like that. So, anyways, here's the forms of the Sega Saturn version of Sonic 3D Flickies Island or Sonic 3D Blast, and from the actual gameplay perspective, it plays remarkably similar to the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version, but there are some slight differences. First of all, the graphics has been updated into its very optimistic look. And on top of all that stuff though, if you couldn't tell, the level transitioning screen actually plays very similar to the forms of how it does in the classic Sonic games. Whilst compared to the forms of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version, it gets like a black screen transition whenever you dive into the next level, and you pretty much get the idea. And also, the special stage on the Sega Saturn version, as you can definitely tell, looks incredibly different, because for one, the background music sounds very awesome as far as I'm aware of, and second of all, of course, not to mention our graphics, because as you can see, everything else is entirely in 3D with these special stages, and not to mention though, it's all in half-pipe, which you might be familiar with this ever since in Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and also as far as I'm aware, they actually become a little bit more challenging compared to the forms of how it does and how pathetically easy it was on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, because usually relatively speaking, with those special stages with the entire comparison's sake, in the Sega Saturn version, if you couldn't tell, we have to go through 2 segments, whilst compared to the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, we have to go through 3 segments. However, I also want to point things out for the fact that both the Sega Saturn and PC versions are technically identical, except with one major difference, and that's of course the special stages, of course, which I'll show one of those clips on the PC versions after we're done with the forms of this particular first special stage right there. And of course, as per expected, I'm going to be going through every single special stages in this particular version of the game as well. Although keep that in mind though, that for the most part, I should probably save more topics more about it until for later. So for now on though, there's our first Chaos Emerald on the Sega Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast or Sonic 3D Flickies Island. So this time it's now in proper shape, and relatively speaking though, it's in 3D of course. So because of that though, yeah, we got one Chaos Emerald and only 6 more to go. So because of that, now as I said before, that there's also the PC version of the special stage, which I'll promise you guys I will show you this. It's like a combination of the Genesis or the Mega Drive and the Saturn mixed in together. I mean, it's got this lame, spritey, likely for lameness to it, but it's also the same kind of special stage you see on the Sega Saturn version, but it just doesn't look nearly as good. And keep that in mind, for the PC version of this special stage right here, you only go through one segment, and that's about it basically, because again, unlike the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, you go for 3 segments, and on the Saturn version you go for 2 segments. So because of that, yeah, you get plenty of rings in this special stage basically. Although as I said this before, for the fact that no matter what though, it's about the fact that of course I'm gonna go for every single Chaos Emerald in this Let's Play either way, on the Sega Saturn version specifically. Although keep that in mind though, I'm only going to be getting 1 emerald per act, as opposed to the forms of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, that I can obviously do have the possibility to try to able to actually collect 2 emeralds per act. So yeah, unlike in the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version, thanks to Tiana by the way, that she did indeed manage able to gather every single Chaos Emeralds ranging from 2 zones in particular, which appears to be Green Grove all the way up to Rusty Ruin. In the Sega Saturn version / the PC version, I'm only going to be going after every single Chaos Emeralds within 4 zones, ranging from Green Grove, Rusty Ruin, Spring Stadium, and finally Diamond Dust Zone, because obviously, much like the forms of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions of Sonic 3D Flickies Island, in order able to actually access the special stage, once again you do need able to collect 50 rings, and then if you try to find either Knuckles or Tails, this way it actually transports you to a special stage. So because of that, now if you're probably wondering why, I'm actually only going to be seeing Knuckles on the first act of Green Grove, because if I do meet up with Tails, and then that way it allows me to able to transport onto the exact same special stage, but the rewards are entirely different. So because of that, for instance though, on this act in particular, if I completed this special stage for 1 time, obviously I can get a Chaos Emerald, but if I go on to the second special stage on the exact same act, instead of giving me the second Chaos Emerald, instead it actually obviously gives me an extra life. So because of that though, yeah, this entire process might take a bit while this time around, compared to the forms of how it does on the previous version, the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions. So yeah, because for the most part though, I still need to be very cautious with the forms to try to look after 50 rings in order to able to try to deliver to not only either Tails but also Knuckles as well. So because of that, yeah, for the most part, the gameplay on the Sega Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast plays very identical to the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, but you can now able to actually use the Sega Saturn 3D control pad. So this means about the fact that using the analog stick is super narrative, or to be more specifically, super comfortable when it comes to dealing with the forms of 3D isometric platforming. So because of that though, although relatively speaking though, if you couldn't tell already, on the actual specific clips from earlier, I recently did manage to edit out the amount of jump cuts in between loading times, because since on the Sega Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast obviously utilizes a lot of loading screens thanks to the forms of the actual CD format, so this means about the fact that, as you can tell, I basically edited out the bunch of loading times, because let me tell you, before Sonic 06 and before Sonic Boom Rise of Loic, the load times are abysmal on the Sega Saturn version of the game, just about as bad as Sonic 06. So because of that though, yeah, you can get the idea for the fact that this entire process might take a bit while this time around, compared to the forms of how it does on the previous version, like I said. So, but I digress. I do say though, is about the fact I do like the color palette upgrades for this particular version of the game. I mean, sure, no matter what though, that the entire gameplay remains the same as before, like I said, but ultimately though, the graphics do look very different, and not to mention though, the music also sounds different too, and it's especially noticeable considering this is on the CD disc. So as a result though, the sound quality sounds a lot more higher, and it also sounds a lot more different too. So because of that though, because unlike the Genesis version or the Mega Drive versions, sometimes usually gets like a twang to it though. Likely, for instance though, is about the fact that, I do remember for the fact that whenever I do manage to replay through the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions of Sonic 3D Flickies Island, my goodness, the soundtrack is magnificent on that particular game, or that particular version of the game for that matter. But I will say though that the Saturn version soundtrack sounds a bit interesting to say the least. I mean, sure, some players attempt to able to prefer the Genesis or the Mega Drive versions, and some people prefers the Sega Saturn version a little bit more, just because of the graphical standpoint, and not only that though, the sound quality is very top notch too. But apart from those side things though, well, yeah, let me know in the comments down below for the question of the day. What specific version of Sonic 3D Flickies Island or Sonic 3D Blast do you attempt to prefer playing? Either the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version or the Sega Saturn version? Well, mind you though, access the PC version nowadays is actually very impossible to do these days, because I've managed able to look at the actual comparison when it comes to likely playing for the PC version on Windows 11 compared to Windows 95. Then my goodness, Windows 11 chugs a lot. So no matter what though, Windows 95 might be a little bit more suitable when it comes to running the game like that. Well, apart from those side things though, it's about the fact that the entire game itself is basically very old, so I would be surprised there. So because of that, now, there are a few things I want to mention about this though, and that's what appears to be for the fact that, well, today's date of course there is the 18th of October today, in some cases in 2025 today, and did you guys know, it's been 1 year ago since Super Mario Party Jamboree did somehow first came out on the Nintendo Switch, and you already know about that, thanks to the bones of how Maxi already did manage to did that Let's Play not too long ago. So because of that though, long story short, it is the greatest Mario Party games ever made, especially now we actually got jam-packed full of content, despite how washed out the Switch 2 edition can be sometimes. But apart from those side things though, I can still honestly try to recommend Super Mario Party Jamboree, specifically the Switch 1 version to be exact, just because of jam-packed full of content. Not only that though, hugest character roster within a grand total of 22 playable characters, and of course, not to mention though, 7 playable boards, which is very massive as it stands. So because of that though, yeah, you can get the idea for this point. So anyway, it is also reassuring about this too, is about the fact that I've recently did manage to order not 1 item, but 3 items, because the reason why I say this is because originally though, I was expecting to try to get myself the double movie pack within Mission Impossible 7 and 8 during the events within day 1, but I have to wait until later today, mainly because in addition about the fact I've recently did manage to order Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning and The Final Reckoning all in double pack. Because let me tell you, the actual cover art as an individual standalone version of The Final Reckoning just feels a bit kind of boring to me. All it shows is just, well, Neve and Hunt's face, and that's about it basically. Not much action impact involved with the actual cover art in my opinion. Well, that's just me. So because of that, yeah, and it's also reassuring about this too. Yes indeed, I've recently pre-ordered the next Nintendo Switch 2 game, and that's of course Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment. So because of that, now if you guys are probably wondering, what about Dragon Ball Sparking Zero? Well, I might have to wait on that for a while, mainly because, as you probably already expect, unfortunately though, the physical version for that game on the Switch 2 version is actually locked up behind the stupid game keycard system. So no matter what though, it might take me a bit of some time to think about it, especially considering about the fact that from what I can gather, that the game keycard physical games for Nintendo Switch 2 cost a bit cheaper compared to the forms of how it does it for getting these games digitally, despite the fact that, relatively speaking, I'm not exactly a digital purchase kind of guy. So no matter what though, apart from a couple of times though, to be more specifically with the forms of I somehow still got the digital version of Pac-Man World 2 Repack on Nintendo Switch 2, plus with the forms of PlayStation 4, because the forms of the digital deluxe editions able to actually fully access to, well, every single DLC of how the actual game itself actually has to offer. So yeah, you get the idea for this point. So, and of course, if you ever played the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version of Sonic 3D Flickies Island, the ultimate goal for this game right here is that you need to be able to rescue 5 of those Flickies depending on what specific sections you go into, and obviously though, your objective is able to put them or try to get 5 Flickies, and then if you come across into a dimensional ring, well, it could either be the checkpoint marker or the X mark stands for the end of the level, and once you're done with that, you move on to the next act, because obviously, much like the defaults of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version of the game, obviously though we have to go through 3 acts per zone, as you can definitely tell. What's interesting about the Sega Saturn version of the game, plus the PC version as well, it does show you a world map before you start the actual next level, so yeah, that's actually pretty interesting to say the least. So, anyways, time for the first boss on the Sega Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast, and sure enough though, it plays remarkably similar to the previous version, except now we got ourselves the interesting boss theme music, so that's pretty cool and interesting at the same time. So regardless of everything else though, oh jeez, that was a definition of the close call right there. And there's also reassuring about this too, is about the fact that I'm shocking to know that Sonic is basically almost done in terms of the forms of Luigi's Mansion 3 after all. I mean, straight to the point though, he's still on the forms of in the 13th floor at the moment. And by that time, once Halloween gets close by, then he might able to try to complete the entire Let's Play of Luigi's Mansion 3 in time, just before Halloween is about to begun. So, and it's also straight to the point, we've only just got about 13 more days to go until Halloween is about to be fully begun. So, yeah, you pretty much get the idea about this point right there. So, anyway, so that pretty much does it for the first zone in Green Grove. Now let's move on to the next zone, which appears to be Rusty Ruin Zone. And I'm gonna say, the background music choice for that particular zone that we're about to be entering into right now sounds a bit interesting, and it also sounds a bit more of an atmospheric tone to it, because even then though, because as you can definitely tell, in addition about the fact that the graphics themselves looks very interesting to say the least, with all that added texture work, and not to mention though, at least if you ever played the PC version as far as I'm aware, some of these sound effects were added, depending on the forms of certain level interactions you did play around with. Like, for instance though, if you try to able to step onto one of those little floor tiles, as you can definitely tell, the one on the left, if you step onto one of them, the actual specific animation plays out a little bit slightly, and there's also another floor tile right there that, as you can see, it did slightly tilt a little. So, whilst for whatever reason the Saturn version doesn't seem to have the sound effects placed like that, but unlike the PC version, it does have a sound effects, what if I did manage to recently found out. So, kind of interesting to say the least though. And also, we can able to once again utilize that particular twirling thing, so to able to actually, you know, meet up with Tails and what have you, so... Because yeah, like I said before, I'm only going to be going after 1 emerald per act, so meaning about the fact that I believe we only just got about 10 chances this time around, as opposed to the forms of how it does it on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, as far as I can recall, that you do able to actually have, let's just say, for about 20 chances, at least as far as I'm aware, because relatively speaking, I was about the fact that, of course, much like the defaults of how it does on the, you know, the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version of Sonic 3D Blast, or Sonic 3D Flickies Island, if you will. Basically, though, it's about the fact that you're able to actually encounter not only Knuckles, but also Tails within only in 5 zones, within Green Grove, and Rusty Ruin, and Spring Stadium, Diamond Dust, and finally Volcano Valley. So because of that though, or Volcanic Valley, or anything else like that, Well, mind you, it's been about a year ago since we've last played Sonic 3D Blast ever since the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version. So because of this though, yeah, I can't even believe we're now finally going to be doing a newer or different version of Sonic 3D Flickies Island, which is of course the Sega Saturn. So yeah, that seems very top notch in my book, especially considering about the fact that despite how the Sega Saturn itself is an interesting game console to say the least, despite the fact that it did flop in not only in America, but in addition to the European countries as well. But ultimately though, it did somehow succeed in Japan though, which I'm not exactly sure why if that seems to be the case, because gee, no wonder why we got so many Japanese exclusives for the Sega Saturn for the longest time, which I'm not exactly sure why that was the case, mind you. Well, keep that in mind though, is that the Sega Saturn did came out exactly the same year as in the PlayStation 1 came out, usually for about a couple of months or a couple of weeks prior. Well, I don't know about you, because it has been quite a while since I actually mentioned something related to both the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn. Well, mind you though, I still managed able to actually got only 5 games in particular, which are all of the Sonic games basically, and 2 of the other games are Knights games. So, that's something worth noting for, so... Alright, so we got the 3rd Chaos Emerald, so logically we've now got 4 Chaos Emeralds to go, so because of that, now if you're probably wondering to yourself, I recently did indeed manage to add in a sound effect every time whenever I do manage to collect the Chaos Emeralds, because if without it, it just feels a bit kind of boring if you do manage to able to do not insert the actual victory fanfare music, because even then, it just feels a bit, well, there. But anyway. And also, what's interesting about the forms of Rusty Ruin Zone on the Sega Saturn version, if you couldn't tell, they actually added in some weather conditions, or specifically, weather, which as you can definitely tell, not only does it rain, but in addition to that, it actually decides to add in fog into it. So, that's pretty interesting in terms of the forms that they added in a weather condition. Although it does that too for the PC version, but it does have some limitations on the PC version. Like, for instance, the PC version does not have a fog effect, so instead, they're able to actually have only rain. So, yeah, that's short something, so... But anyway, so, yeah, I guess aside from all that particular stuff as far as comparisons as far as I'm aware, well, obviously that was about the fact that since this is on the Sega Saturn, of course, this means about the fact that obviously though that, like I said before, the music sounds a lot different, and not only that, the graphics looks a bit more updated here and there. But aside from all that stuff though, you can still able to try to find those interesting elemental shields ranging from not only the flame shield, which obviously still protects you from fire hazards if you couldn't tell, and as well as that, the yellow shield acts like the homing shield, which does come in handy if you try to jump into those little bandings and stuff like that. And there's also the blue shield, which obviously signifies that, spoiler alert, that will functions as an electric shield, which does protect you from electric floors and all that stuff, which is especially noticeable in during the forms within the final 2 zones coming up, between both Gene Gadget Zone and Panic Puppet Zone, because again, if you're following for our Let's Play of the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version of Sonic 3D Blast, you know exactly what I'm talking about, especially because, again, it plays very similar to the forms of how it does on the previous version, but only now, with high quality and all that stuff, so... yeah, you can get the idea for this point. I think, fundamentally speaking though, that when it comes to the forms of the another comparison within the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version of Sonic 3D Blast, in comparison to the Sega Saturn version, the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version only came out not only in the European countries, but in addition to the American countries as well. However, on the Sega Saturn version does indeed manage to able to have 3 regional releases within the forms of being not only the American version, but in addition to the European version, as well as the Japanese version. So because of that, yeah, only Japanese players can able to only experience the Sega Saturn version for the time. So because of that though, seems kind of odd, doesn't it? It wasn't until specifically until when 2002 rolls around, where thanks to the forms of Sonic Mega Collection for the Nintendo GameCube rolls around, Japanese players will now finally get a chance to play the Sonic 3D Flickies Island for the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, despite the fact that they are all in English. So yeah, I just don't understand what the forms of that particular, well, they just forgot able to actually put it in Japanese text in the forms of in some retro games back in the day. So yeah, it seems kind of odd. So, and also, if you managed able to hear that victory fanfare, if you managed to complete the act, that was before when Sonic R was a thing, despite the fact that in Sonic R, in that particular victory fanfare, they managed to sped up a little bit, whilst compared to the forms of how it does in this game in particular, it does manage able to have some bit of slower tone to it. So yeah, that's one way to put it with the forms of some comparisons anyway. And also, I really love the actual text fonts was in 3D as opposed to 2D, so I guess that makes it pretty obvious considering for the fact that this game was indeed called Sonic 3D Blast or Sonic 3D Flickies Island for those of you who lived in European countries, as well as the Japanese version. So, because keep that in mind, the American version first came out in 1996, and then meanwhile for the European version came out in 1997, and finally, in the Japanese version comes out until 1999. So it's roughly almost the exact same year as in, let's just say, Sonic Pocket Adventure for Neo Geo Pocket Color did came out. So yeah, it seems kind of interesting when it comes to the forms of major releases for some Sonic games back then. So, whilst every nowadays though, when it comes to the forms of most recently, Sonic Racing Cross Worlds, Sonic X Shadow Generations, Sonic Superstars, Sonic Origins / Sonic Origins Plus, Sonic Mania, and you get the idea, they all basically just releasing in that specific year. Well, it's hard for me to explain personally, because it's been quite a while since we actually played a Sonic game since, well, Sonic and the Black Knight, thanks to Silver the Hedgehog, did somehow manage able to tackle for that particular game as a redo Let's Play recently. So, anyways, let's get on to the 4th special stage, where, depending on what special stage you go into, I love the actual background details. Like, for instance though, on the 3rd and 4th special stage, as you can see, we ended up in, let's just say in the skies above, but ultimately though, as you can see, we actually see those little mountains in the background, which I'm guessing is like a similar background tone as the forms of Underground Zone from Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for both Sega Game Gear / Sega Master System, at least as far as I'm aware of. So yeah, either way. So yeah, because for the most part, that's as far as I can try to say about the forms of today's topic at this point. I mean, I would have liked able to explain more about the forms of what's been happening so far, but ultimately though, it's about the fact that for the most part though, we only just mentioned about the forms of the actual specific comparison within, you know, the Genesis / Mega Drive version of Sonic 3D Flickies Island to the Sega Saturn version and the PC version as well. So because of that though, yeah, I got nothing else to add. Although something's worth knowing for too, that between both the Sega Saturn version and the PC version does indeed, not only does it have FMV intro, but in addition to that, the outro as well. So unlike the forms of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version, it's almost like, I don't know, kind of compressed, but it also does have some still images depending on the forms of the actual cutscenes you run into. So, but yeah, got nothing else to say. So even then, and as far as I'm aware, the special stage difficulty-wise, it starts off as pretty easy and self-explanatory, but eventually it gets a bit tougher later on, which that's the reason why that some people attempt to prefer playing Sonic 3D Flickies Island on the Sega Saturn compared to the forms of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, which I can honestly understand why. And it's also worth noting for the fact that trying to get the physical version is not as easy as it sounds, at least as far as future years as far as I'm concerned, because, well, relatively speaking, no wonder why that the Sega Saturn was actually a flop, in not only in America, but in addition to, well, the European versions as well, considering about the fact that that was around that time, about the fact that Sega also did manage to release in 1995, which appears to be a pretty useless add-on for the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis, which appears to be the Mega 32X, which is basically like a 32-bit add-on for the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis. That does have some higher capabilities when it comes to graphics and what have you, and it's also some segments does usually has like 3D elements. Specifically, for example, in Knuckles Chaotix, they attempt able to have 3D special stages, which is very revolutionary at the time, but ultimately though, it did not sell well because of commercial failure, which is very understandable that, gee, no wonder why getting physical games nowadays when it comes to not only the Sega Mega CD games, but in addition to Sega Mega Drive 32X cartridges, gets really expensive these days, which is especially noticeable if you try to go after complete in-box condition, whilst I'm pretty sure that could be also applies for America and Japanese versions as well, at least as far as I can recall correctly, but either way, my point stands exactly, so, but anyway, so, and of course, much like the forms of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis version, when it comes to depending on what act you go into, the music also sounds slightly different too, depending on what act you go into, so because of that, yeah, everything else checks out there for the most part. Although, fun fact actually, that Sonic did actually tell me about this, is that back in the day, there was this particular bootleg game called Sonic 3D Blast 5, and no matter what though, if you heard of that particular bootleg game before, well, it plays very awkwardly, which I'll discuss more about that and during at some point until tomorrow, because as far as I'm aware, the uploading schedules for Sonic 3D Flickies Island / Sonic 3D Blast for the Sega Saturn version for uploading schedule department is obviously going to be taking place in weekend, much like the forms of how it does on the Mega Drive / Sega Genesis versions, so, but I digress. So, and of course you're able to actually rescue, you know, 5 Flickies, depending on what section you go into, obviously. And there are 4 different kinds of Flickies, ranging from blue, pink, purple, and of course, well, let's say, blue, purple, and red and green variations of these Flickies. And no matter what though, the blue ones are not too shabby, because the blue Flickies obviously attempts to follow where Sonic is, and then pink ones, or purple ones to be exactly, they behave a little bit, quite normal to me though, but the red ones attempts to jump all over the place, and then the green ones are by far the most annoying because they attempt to run away from you. So yeah, that's very annoyingly consistent, especially noticeable whenever we go into the forms within the 5th zone, you might see nothing yet. Well, at least after we need to able to try to collect the last 3 Chaos Emeralds, which again, I have to collect one of the Chaos Emeralds per act this time, so this means I've now got about, I would say, 6 chances left before you're able to actually access to the final zone, which is of course the final fight, much like the forms of how it does on the previous version. So, and for the most part, that's as far as I can try to talk about the forms of today's discussion, I'm afraid. I mean, straight to the point though is about the fact that I'll get into more details about the forms that, you know, that bootleg game I used to play back then, which appears to be, of course, Sonic 3D Blast 5 for the Game Boy system, so, but I digress. So, yeah, I suppose with that being said, folks, is that we should probably end things off this point right here. So join me next time for more Let's Play of Sonic 3D Blast or Sonic 3D Flickies Island for the Sega Saturn version, is that we're about to be jumping into the 3rd zone in this particular version of the game, which takes place in Spring Stadium Zone. So because of that though, yeah, that'll be exciting. So I'll see you guys until tomorrow. Later, fellas.